Today we're going to talk about overhauling your triceps. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart because I have had a hell of a time trying to get my little pea shooters to grow over the years. If you're anything like me, you have shorter arms, your shoulders take over everything so that after your shoulders do all the work they have to contribute, by the time it's time for your elbow to lock out, there isn't a lot of work left for your tricep to do. So my triceps never grew from pressing. I had to get creative, do some other things. Now, there's two reasons you want your triceps to grow. One is because you want some aesthetics. You want a bigger muscle so you actually look like you work out. The other is so that they can contribute to heavier presses so you can perform at a higher level. I'm assuming that you want both, at least in some capacity, and we're going to break down all of the different ways you can go about getting that end result. Now, the first thing I want to address, if you are having trouble getting your triceps into gear, it's basic receptivity, basic activation. I'm sure you've heard at some point people talk about things like glute activation. If you don't know how to engage your glutes in something like a deadlift, then you're going to end up doing things like clamshells and glute bridges until you can feel those muscles kick into gear, and then you're going to learn how to apply that to more complex movements like actual hip hinging. Your upper body isn't really any different. If your triceps aren't doing their job, you might need to find some ways to really accentuate their role in the movement and learn how to utilize them as you drive that weight through to lockout. Some of my favorite receptivity exercises involve just blood flow, involve just getting a bunch of blood into the muscle, and it starts to get really twitchy. You start to get this awareness of it. Like when your pecs get full of blood from bench pressing, you feel like you can bounce your pecs, they get real twitchy. You want that same thing in your triceps. And when you do that, you're gonna be amazed at how when you set in, you can feel them engage at the bottom of a bench press. You can feel how they kick in to floss your elbows through at the top to get those efficient and aggressive lockouts. So I really like high rep banded press downs. Taking a band, it doesn't have to be a lot of tension, and you want to clip through them pretty quickly. You want to be aggressive with those, and you want to shoot for like 50 reps. Those go really well at the end as an absolute finisher to just annihilate them, and they actually go really well as a warm-up, provided you don't completely obliterate them. Occlusion training is another viable way to do this, where you tie off your arms with kind of a makeshift tourniquet, but it drives just a ton of blood into the muscle. So if you've had problems feeling your triceps, this is one of the quickest ways to remedy that. I also like rope press downs with really, really long ropes. In fact, my gym has an amazing attachment. The rope, it actually feeds through a pulley, so you can get more pull apart at the bottom. You can get your arms behind you and pull the rope more evenly. And I've never felt my triceps cramp up like when I utilize that movement. It's now become one of my favorites. And I'm actually gonna put a link to that in the description if you wanna check that attachment. So now that we can feel them working, we wanna cover the meat and potatoes of tricep developmental work. There's two big ways you're gonna hit your triceps. One is through pressing movements. The tricep extends the elbow, and when you get to use your shoulder in conjunction with that, you get to use a lot more weight. So pressing movements are a foundational way of overloading the tricep, and you can utilize variations that exaggerate the top end, because remember, as you get closer to lockout, the tricep is what drives that elbow through. So by isolating that range of motion, you're doing more tricep heavy work. Also, extensions, anything that isolates that elbow extension, is going to be a basic tricep developmental movement. With pressing movements, you can either overload or you can do a disadvantage pressing movement. Now, I've talked a lot about disadvantage movements in the past. That's where you put more of the work in the joint, so you have the joint go through a longer range of motion, or you change the leverages of the movement so that more of the work is being done in that joint. With any press, the way that you disadvantage the elbow to get the tricep to do more work, you put more of the work into the elbows. So you push the elbows out further, you get more range to the elbows, most easily done with a closer grip. So close grip benching is going to be an absolute staple. I don't recommend getting your hands super close because then the angle of your wrist becomes a limiting factor. You just need to come in about shoulder width or considerably more narrow than where you normally bench press. That's going to be enough to target your triceps more so than how they've gotten targeted before. You want to do these with a tempo. You want them under control. You want to, again, feel the receptivity. Feel how your triceps floss those elbows through to lock out those big weights. I recommend full extension, holding for a second at the top. I recommend a controlled eccentric. And I actually recommend stopping about an inch off your chest. Again, not overstraining the wrist. and learning how to fire the triceps through, because that tends to be where they kick in, is once you've already gotten the bar moving off your chest. So I'm a big fan of close grip work. I like them for volume, I like them for more reps, and again, I like them done under control at a set tempo. That's how you're gonna get the most out of it. Real quick, guys, if you found any of this helpful, if this is gassing you up, you're getting excited to go in and handle your next tricep workout, please consider hitting the subscribe button. I put out 4 to 6 videos a week, and you don't want to miss when I put something new out. I'm also making that hard push to 100,000. It's a ridiculous number I never thought I'd get remotely close to, but I'm only approaching that number because of your support, and I thoroughly appreciate it. So please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for your support. It means the world to me. Another one of my favorite disadvantage movements is a JM press. I've done a video on JM presses in the past. Many of you are familiar with this or you've heard about it. It can be a little awkward for people to execute at first, but just take it slow, hit a couple basic cues, and feel again how the triceps take on the load and how you punch through at the top. Essentially a JM press, I think of it as a skull crusher to your chin. So I'm in this close grip position. I'm running my elbows forward. I'm letting that bar back. I'm aiming for my forearm to be horizontal, to be parallel with the ground at the bottom. And I feel a ton of load in my elbows. I'm looking for that tension in my elbows. And from here, with the elbows high, I'm looking at punching through. So this is a lot more of a press type movement than it is a tricep extension. So load is going to be higher. You're going to be able to use not quite as much weight as with a close grip bench, but a lot more than with something like a skull crusher. I do recommend using sleeves. Sometimes the pressure in your elbows can be a little extreme if you have elbow problems, but some sleeves or some cuffs, getting a lot of blood in your elbow, getting some heat in your elbow can help. And you do adapt. And the thing is, as you adapt, your elbows actually get thicker, the tendons should become stronger. So I'm a big fan of these two movements. Now going over to the overloaded pressing movement. These are any movements that are going to allow you to handle more weight. So it's going to be less extension, more press, specifically at the top. So any type of elevated press, board presses count, but I'm not so much a fan of board presses as I am of pin presses. I like starting from the bottom and learning how to fire through and accelerate. Again, getting the tricep to really practice this movement where it is taking control and being responsible for this hard lockout. So pin presses, I like to go 2 to 4 inches off the chest, practice getting set up, getting tight, and firing up from a dead stop. Again, exaggerating lockout, holding for a second or two at the top, making sure you feel how the triceps contribute to that movement. Floor presses are another variation I really like. Very easy to set up, not very technical. Again, just practicing control and flossing those elbows through. Pin presses and floor presses, both great overloaded movements. And then any accommodating resistance is going to do the trick. Bands, chains, anything that adds more weight as you get closer to the top. The only reason I don't really prescribe a lot of accommodating resistance work is because it can be a pain in the ass to set up. There's a lot of trial and error. And when it comes to just getting this little muscle on the back of your arm to grow, you have so much variety, so much options between pressing movements, barbell movements, machine movements. I don't think accommodating resistance has such a special effect on your tricep growth or lockout power that it's really worth the trouble. So that's mainly the reason I don't do it, but I know that there are plenty of people that have had really good results using bands and using overloaded movements. You just have to be smart about how you set it up. You can't just swap out all your pressing movements for banded movements and expect good results across the board. Now, the last pressing movement is a dip. It doesn't really fit into an overloaded or disadvantaged movement. It certainly is a different motor pattern, but you are moving at the shoulder and the elbow. It's very much a press. Dips are a fantastic tricep developer. I don't really like to go too deep. I think they have the greatest potential to develop your upper body, especially your triceps, when you don't really focus on going so deep, but you really put your emphasis on the top 3/4 of the movement. When I do a ton of reps, I usually cut depth short and just focus on the lockout. You can do all kinds of variations to hit the triceps. You can stay more upright and practice loading into your elbows. Think of it as like a high bar variation of your dip. That's going to hit your triceps quite a bit. You can do body weight, you can do tempo, you can do partial ranges of motion. You can add weight. In fact, one of the easiest ways I think to use accommodating resistance is to strap a band to yourself to overload the top. I just take a mini band, put it over my neck, hook it on the handles. So as I push through at the top, I get a lot more resistance right at lockout, and that absolutely torches my tricep. Big fan of dips. If you have shoulder issues, you can do machine variations. You can play around with depth. Don't think that you have to bottom out your dips to get the benefit. I am a huge proponent of just partial, aggressive, high rep dips. The more time you spend on parallel bars in a locked out position, just like any gymnast you've ever seen, I'm telling you, your triceps are gonna respond to that. And the thing about dips is you can put them anywhere. They go great on benching days. They go great on overhead pressing days. If you have a separate arm day, you can do it as like GPP for your upper body, as like a main tricep movement. Dips just go about anywhere. They're a great exercise. Now we're gonna get into the finesse movements. These are the extensions. So now we're not relying on your shoulder to move, to add assistance so you can handle more weight. Now we're focused on isolating the tricep. Now the variations break down into a couple of categories. I don't like to get lost in which head you're working in so much. You're gonna work the long head more in this plane. You're gonna work the short head more in this plane coming out to the side like with a row press down. The long head is of course much bigger and thicker. It's more responsible for strength and lockout power, but I don't believe it's really that important that you hyper fixate on which head you're working in. I think a much more productive way to separate these out is to think if you're working more the contraction component, the full squeeze at lockout, or if you're working the stretch, as in how to get that muscle as lengthened as possible. So the way this works out is that any movement where your arm is over your head is going to stretch the tricep much, much, much more. So if you've never done something like a French press or a behind the neck dumbbell extension, you're gonna notice that if you get a good stretch on that, the first time you do it, you're gonna be really, really sore. So that is a great developmental tool, is to come up, and you can practice it right now. Just flex your arm like you're doing a curl with your hand by your shoulder, and feel as you point your elbow up, you're getting more and more and more stretched. Whereas you can have your elbow as flexed as you want if it's in by your side. This doesn't really stretch your tricep hardly at all. Now, conversely, if you want to contract the tricep as hard as possible, if you want to shorten it as much as possible, that happens down behind your back. So if you're doing like a dumbbell kickback, and you can feel this as well, straighten your arm all the way, squeeze your tricep as hard as you can, and then feel what happens as you bring your arm down back to the side, all the way behind you. Right there, it's gonna start cramping up quite a bit. So stretching exercises, anything over the head, you can do rope extensions behind the head, you can do French presses with a barbell, you can do one arm tricep extensions, you can do tape presses, which I'm a big fan of. Those will all stretch the tricep quite a bit at the bottom. Now you can contrast that with the contraction exercises. These are the ones that help with receptivity. I talked about that earlier. The squeeze, the pump you're gonna get at the bottom is gonna be very intense. That's gonna help you feel throughout the entire motion and really get a sense of what your triceps are doing. Anything that gets your elbow behind your back. So seated bench dips are really good. Squeezing at the top with your elbow behind you. Dumbbell kickbacks are actually really good. If you've never done them before, you don't have to go heavy. You would be absolutely amazed what 10 or 15 pound dumbbells can do to just decimate your triceps at the end of a workout. And a little trick to get more out of some of your favorite tricep exercises is a decline skull crusher. So because your tricep is gonna be squeezed more as your arm comes down, it doesn't have to be all the way behind you. If you're doing a skull crusher and you're laying down, if all of a sudden you're on a decline bench where now you're locking out at this angle, that's going to present a more full, a deeper contraction at the top. And again, you're gonna be surprised if you've never done that before, that can add a little bit. And then lastly, you can actually bleed those two components together to get an absolute monster effect by changing your elbow position throughout the movement. So I don't know if you've ever seen somebody laying down in a skull crusher, coming behind their head in a pullover movement, getting a stretch, coming up and through, and then extending at the top. You might think that they're using momentum or they're cheating, or that's not how you isolate the movement. They're actually getting the best of both worlds. They're getting a deep stretch at the bottom of the movement, and then they're getting a full contraction at the top. And yeah, if you use a little bit of sway, it also adds a momentum element that lets you handle a little more weight. But this is an absolute punishing variation to get a little bit more out of your tricep development. There's another movement that I really like as a finisher that moves in very much the same way. I call this an inverted skull crusher. You're basically going to set a barbell in the rack about chest high. You're going to get in an incline push-up position, and you are going to, just releasing at the elbows, let yourself through, put your head down, get a stretch at the top, come through, squeeze at the top. And what this movement does is really loads the stretch. You're gonna notice that you're under a lot more tension during the stretch phase. The top end really just serves to squeeze the tricep and trap blood. So you're gonna notice a pumping effect throughout all of these reps. As you get 15, 20 reps out, every rep your triceps going to feel more engorged. It's a great finishing movement. I like it's easy on the elbows. It's a good way to start to temper your elbows to being flexed deeply under a lot of stress. But because you're starting out with your body weight, it's not super intense. And this is one of my favorite exercises when I was working around elbow tendonitis, because with just my body weight and not using a lot of resistance at the top, I could just focus on driving blood in. Elbows felt great, triceps got engorged. It was an absolutely great finishing. Now, hopefully this list gave you some ideas. Putting these together in a workout is super easy. These are obviously going to pair up with your main pressing work. So if you have multiple bench days, or if you have a bench day and an overhead day, you want to include some variations of the main press that hit the triceps. So it's really easy to throw in either partial work like pin presses or floor presses, or to throw in some disadvantage work like close grip or JM presses as part of like your main strength work. And then after that, you just want 15 to 20 sets throughout the week of focused tricep work. You can distribute that across several of these exercises and get creative. You can pair these movements together. You can run supersets. You can alternate. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but keep the effort very, very high and do a lot of repeating sets, and make sure you don't skip it at the end of your workout. If you're doing your tricep work twice a week in conjunction with pressing twice a week, you'll know if you're doing enough work because your triceps will grow. And in the same vein, you'll know exactly if you're not doing enough work because they will stay small. You can always add more sets. You can always apply a little more effort to the work that you're doing. You can always tweak the movements to represent a bigger, more substantial stimulus. You guys have a lot of options. It's just up to you to lay out the work, put it into practice, collect your results, and then determine, was it enough or do I need to turn that dial? So if you have any questions, leave it in the comments, or better yet, take it to Patreon. That is where I upload my training daily with commentary. So you get to see how I put these principles into practice on a daily basis. It is also the easiest place to get in touch with me if you have questions. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. I'm making the hard push to 100,000, and the only reason I'm even close to that number is because of the support you guys have given me. Thank you so much. It is greatly appreciated. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.